The closing documents arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, delivered by a paralegal from Rosenthal and Vance LLP, in a manila envelope sealed with a blue sticker that said confidential in block capitals the size of a thumbnail. The paralegal, a young woman named Andrea Torres, who had been doing closing deliveries for the firm for 2 years, and who had developed, through those 2 years, a calibrated sense for the weight of what she was carrying based on the thickness of the envelope and the address she was delivering to, had driven that morning from the firm's offices on Peachtree Street in Atlanta to a house on Vance Road in Smyrna, Georgia, which was a suburb of Atlanta that was 23 minutes from downtown on a clear morning, and a different geography entirely in terms of the houses and the driveways, and the yards with the grass still going brown at the edges from the October dry. The house on Vance Road was a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow with a covered front porch and a vegetable garden along the south fence that had been put to bed for the winter, the tomato cages removed, and the soil turned and covered with a 4-inch layer of pine straw mulch from a bag of Scott's premium mulch that was still sitting on the porch steps, because the man who had applied the mulch the previous Saturday had not yet put it in the recycling bin. The man who answered the door was 44 years old, 5 feet 11, wearing a canvas Carhartt apron over a flannel shirt, and holding in his left hand a ceramic mug of black coffee that he had brewed that morning in a Moccamaster KBG Select drip brewer in brushed silver that sat on the kitchen counter next to a wooden knife block and a clay pot with a rosemary plant that needed water. His name was Owen Grady. He was a carpenter. Andrea Torres handed him the envelope. He signed the delivery confirmation on her tablet with a stylus that she handed him from her jacket pocket. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Congratulations," which was what the paralegal said at closings regardless of her knowledge of the specifics, because closings were generally occasions that warranted the word. He said, "Thank you again." She walked back to her car, which was a 2021 Honda Civic in silver, and pulled out of the driveway, and Owen Grady went back inside with the manila envelope and put it on the kitchen table next to his coffee. He looked at it for a moment. He did not open it immediately. He went to the window above the kitchen sink and looked at the vegetable garden along the south fence and the pine straw mulch and the November light coming in flat and clear over the roof of the house next door. Then his daughter came downstairs in her school uniform, navy polo and khaki pants and one sock already on and the other in her hand, which was always how she appeared on Tuesday mornings, the left sock trailing, and the moment that had been a private moment became a morning, and the morning required him, and he turned from the window. The envelope sat on the kitchen table. Inside it was the recorded deed for a 14-story mixed-use office and retail building at 1140 West Peachtree Street, NW in Midtown Atlanta, Georgia, known in the Atlanta commercial real estate market as the Callaway Tower, which had been built in 1987 and renovated in 2014, and which currently housed, among its 43 tenants, the Atlanta satellite office of a technology company called Nexus Digital Group, which paid $212,000 per month in rent for floors 9 through 12, and which was run by a man named Brandon Callaway, who had founded it at 28, scaled it to $1 billion valuation at 35, and been featured on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle 3 times in 7 years, and who was, by every external measure, one of the most recognizable business people in the city. Brandon Callaway did not know, on the Tuesday morning when Andrea Torres drove to Vance Road in Smyrna with the manila envelope, that the building he rented 4 floors of had changed hands. He would not know for 11 days, when a letter arrived on Nexus Digital Group letterhead addressed to him personally and signed by a man whose name he did not recognize, informing him that Callaway Tower had been acquired by Grady Holdings LLC and that the terms of the Nexus Digital Group lease would be honored through its current term, and that Mr. Grady looked forward to an introductory conversation at the tenant's convenience. Brandon Callaway had read the letter at his standing desk on the 11th floor of Callaway Tower. He did not occupy the floors he rented. He occupied the floors he was named for, which was a different calculation, and had asked his executive assistant, a meticulous woman named Portia Bell who had been managing his professional life for 4 years, who Grady Holdings LLC was. Portia had looked it up and come back 20 minutes later and said, with the specific careful neutrality of a person who was delivering information that was surprising without editorializing the surprise, Grady Holdings LLC is a Georgia limited liability company registered 2 years ago. The registered agent is Rosenthal and Vance LLP. The manager of record is an individual named Owen Grady. She had paused, And then she had said, "I cannot find a public profile for him anywhere." No LinkedIn, no press mentions, no company website. Brandon Calloway had looked at her for a moment. Then he had looked at the letter again. The building had cost $26 million. He had paid $22 million in rent over 11 years. The man who had just bought it, quietly and completely, had no public profile, no press mentions, no LinkedIn, and lived in a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow in Smyrna with a vegetable garden along the south fence. Drop your city in the comments. Let us see how far this story travels. The man whose name was on the building, Brandon Calloway, had started Nexus Digital Group in a 2-bedroom apartment on Ponce de Leon Avenue in Atlanta's Ponce Highland neighborhood in 2010, when he was 28 years old, and had just left a senior product role at a mid-sized SaaS company in Buckhead, where he had spent 4 years watching decisions being made by people who did not understand the products they were deciding about, and had concluded, in the specific way that competent people working in the wrong structure eventually conclude these things, that the structure was not going to change, and he was going to have to build his own. He had started with a single product, a real-time data integration platform for mid-market retail companies that needed their inventory, sales, and logistics data to talk to each other in ways that the off-the-shelf enterprise software of the era did not facilitate without expensive customization. He had built the first version himself, in the apartment on Ponce de Leon Avenue, on a 2009 MacBook Pro that still had a sticker on it from the SaaS company he had left, which he had removed on the first morning in the apartment because the sticker was from the old place, and this was the new place, and he did not want to be looking at the old place while he built the new one. The first customer had been a regional grocery chain based in Gainesville, Georgia, with 11 locations. The second had been a hardware and home improvement distributor in Chattanooga. The third had been a regional pharmacy chain in Alabama. By the end of the third year, Nexus had 41 customers, 12 employees, and revenue of $4.2 million, which was not a billion-dollar company, but was, in the specific terms of what a person starting with a laptop and a 2-bedroom apartment in Atlanta could build in 3 years, a genuine result. He had moved the company into its first real office at 2,200 square feet in a shared building on Juniper Street in Midtown in the 4th year, and had moved twice more before the Calloway Tower lease, each move marking a growth event that was both operational and symbolic, the changing address being the external evidence of what the revenue figures confirmed internally. He had signed the Calloway Tower lease in year 7, for 28,000 square feet across 4 floors, at a monthly rent that was $212,000, and that he had signed without lengthy negotiation because he had wanted the building and the building's address, and the statement that the address made about what the company had become, which was a company of 240 employees with annual recurring revenue of $63 million and a valuation, at the Series C round that had closed 2 months before the lease signing, of $1.1 billion. He was 35 when the lease was signed. He was on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle 6 weeks later under the headline, "Nexus Hits Unicorn Status." He had put the magazine, which Portia had framed in a 12 by 12 black frame from Framebridge, on the wall of the conference room on the 12th floor that the team called the War Room, not because he wanted to look at his own face on the wall, but because the team had been there for the whole of it, and the cover was as much theirs as his, and the War Room was the room where everyone was. He had grown up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, the oldest of 2 children of a woman who ran a hair salon on Memorial Drive called Gloria's, which had been there since 1991, and a man who had worked as a systems analyst for the Georgia Department of Transportation for 22 years before retiring at 61 to spend more time doing the thing he had always wanted to do more of, which was fishing at Lake Lanier in a 14-foot aluminum John boat he kept at a marina in Gainesville. Brandon had grown up watching his father work the job with the specific patience of a man who was doing the work that was available and was grateful for it while holding in him the thing that was actually his, the quiet, particular thing that the lake and the early morning and the aluminum boat contained. He thought about this sometimes at the standing desk on the 11th floor of Calloway Tower in the specific way that the children of patient people think about patience, which is with a complicated mixture of admiration and the private acknowledgement that they themselves were not built for it. Brandon moved fast. He had always moved fast. He made decisions quickly and at scale, and with the kind of conviction that was sometimes right and sometimes not, but was never ambiguous. And the clarity of the conviction was in many ways as important to the company's momentum as the correctness of any individual decision. He was regarded in Atlanta's startup community with the specific regard reserved for the people who had made it in a way that was native to the city rather than imported from the coasts. The regard that had in it both admiration and ownership, the city's sense that he was one of theirs. He had been careful to maintain this, not as a performance, but as a genuine commitment to remaining available to the community that had been the context of everything he had built. He mentored. He invested in early-stage Atlanta companies through a small angel portfolio he managed personally. He spoke at Georgia Tech and Morehouse and Spelman. He had written a check to the Benjamin E. Mays High School STEM program, his own high school, for $300,000 in the year after the Series C, because the program had been the reason he had learned to code, and the reason was worth honoring. He was, in summary, a person who had built something real and who wore it honestly and without pretension, and who had signed a lease for 4 floors of a building in Midtown Atlanta for $212,000 a month, with the full and legitimate expectation that the building would simply be the building, the context for the work, the address that said what the company had become, a fixed and unremarkable fact in the background of the actual story. The building had changed hands without his knowledge, quietly and completely, and the person who had bought it was a carpenter in Smyrna who had never been in a magazine. Owen Grady had been a carpenter for 21 years, which was longer than he had been anything else in his adult life, and longer than he had originally intended to be when he started. He had started at 23 after 2 years at Georgia Perimeter College, now Georgia State University Perimeter College, the name having changed through a merger in 2016, where he had studied business administration in the specific unfocused way of a young person who knows they need a direction and has not yet found the one that is theirs, and where he had taken an elective in architectural history in his 2nd year because it fit his schedule and had found in that class the thing he had not known he was looking for. The architectural history class had been taught by a professor named James Whitfield, who had spent 30 years in the field before returning to teaching, and who taught the history of buildings not as dates and styles, but as decisions made by people under conditions, the conditions being always some combination of what materials were available, what money was present, and what the builder believed was worth building and for whom. Owen had attended every class, which was not his pattern in the other courses, and had gone to office hours twice, which was also not his pattern, and had asked questions that Professor Whitfield had described in his end-of-semester notes as the questions of someone who was already thinking like a builder. He had not finished the business administration degree. He had transferred to a carpentry apprenticeship program run through the Associated Builders and Contractors of Georgia, a 4-year program that combined classroom instruction with on-the-job training under a licensed journeyman, and he had completed it in 3 years because he had worked the hours that were available, and then the hours that were not, and had taken every difficult assignment his journeyman offered because the difficult assignments were the ones that taught the things that the easy assignments did not. He had worked for a residential renovation firm called Hartwell Building Group in Marietta for 6 years, rising from apprentice to lead carpenter to site superintendent on projects that ranged from single-room renovations to full-house rebuilds. He had been offered a project manager position at Hartwell at 31 and had declined it because the project manager role was a desk role, and he was not yet ready to leave the site, which was where the actual building happened, and where he still had things to learn about how the building happened. He had met Anna at a Tuesday evening class at the Lassiter High School Adult Education Program in Marietta, a watercolor class that both of them had signed up for independently, and neither of them had much talent for, which had been the basis of the first real conversation, the admission over paint-covered paper that neither of them was going to be a watercolorist, and the question of whether they were going to come back next week anyway. They had both come back. They had gotten coffee after the 3rd class at a Waffle House on Roswell Road, which was the coffee place that was open at 9:15 on a Tuesday evening within walking distance of the school, and which Anna had described as the most honest first-date location she had been to, honest being her word for the thing about a Waffle House that was exactly itself, without apology or aspiration. Anna was a licensed practical nurse at Wellstar Kennestone Hospital in Marietta. She had grown up in Aquirth, the youngest of 4 siblings, and had a laugh that Owen had heard from across the watercolor classroom before he had fully registered her face. A specific kind of laugh, genuine and unguarded. The laugh of a person who did not calculate the performance of amusement, but simply found things funny, and said so in the way that laughter is saying so. They had been married at 33, in a ceremony at a small outdoor venue in Canton, Georgia, under oak trees that were doing the October thing with their leaves, in front of 74 people who were everyone who mattered, no one included for obligation or appearance. Anna had worn a dress she bought at a consignment shop in Roswell that she had altered herself at the kitchen table using a Brother CS 6000i sewing machine from Costco and a YouTube tutorial on taking in a waist seam, which she had described to Owen as the most satisfying project she had completed that year, which was a description he had loved because it was entirely Anna, and because it communicated something about what they were going to be as a marriage. People who solved the solvable problems with the tools available and did not perform either the problem or the solution. Lily was born 2 years into the marriage. She was a straightforward birth, according to Anna's account, meaning that it had been difficult in all the ways births were difficult, and without the complications that made them more so, and she had arrived at 6:15 in the morning as a person who intended to be here and had opinions about it immediately. She had Anna's eyes and Owen's mouth, and a quality, visible from the first weeks, of paying attention to everything with the full focus of someone who had arrived in a new place, and was cataloging it with thoroughness and without haste. Anna had died when Lily was 4. A diagnosis that arrived in February and moved through the year with the specific, terrible speed of the things you are not ready for, the speed that does not accommodate the pace at which understanding arrives in the people who are living through it. Anna had been a practical person about her own life, and she was a practical person about the end of it, not in the sense of being emotionally disconnected, but in the sense of using the time for the things that mattered rather than the things that didn't, which meant the conversations and the being present and the arrangements that would make what came after manageable for Owen and Lily. She had made Owen promise 3 things. The first was that he would not stop the garden, because Lily had grown up with the garden as a constant, and it was a constancy that would be useful when other constancies had changed. The second was that he would let Lily be sad when she was sad and not try to solve the sadness with activity, because she would need to feel it to get through it. The third was that he would keep building things, not for her but for himself, because he was a person who thought through his hands and the thinking mattered and she had always known it. He had kept all 3 promises. The garden was on the south fence. Lily was allowed to be sad when she was sad, and she had come through it with the specific resilience of a child whose parent has prepared her for the passing rather than protecting her from it, which was a harder kind of love and a more honest one. And Owen had kept building things, in the shop behind the house where he kept his Powermatic 2000B table saw and his DeWalt DW735X thickness planer, and his Festool Domino DF500 joiner, and the workbench he had built himself from reclaimed Douglas fir with a bench-crafted glide leg vise that he had assembled one Saturday in September 2 years after Anna died, working alone in the shop with the radio on. The radio tuned to WABE Atlanta Public Radio, because Anna had always had public radio on, and the silence without it was the wrong kind of silence. He had started buying real estate at 38, which was 2 years after Anna died, and 1 year after he had sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with Lily asleep upstairs and a legal pad in front of him, and worked through the numbers that Anna had always worked through. Because Anna had been the one who managed their finances with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything, and who had left behind a filing cabinet in the second bedroom with folders organized by category, in a system that had taken Owen 2 weeks to fully understand, and that he had then used as the basis for his own version of the same system, which was less color-coded and more annotated, because his natural mode was notes in the margin rather than categories on a label. What the numbers said, when he worked through them on the Sunday evening with the legal pad and Lily asleep upstairs, was that they were in a reasonable position. Not a wealthy position, a reasonable one. He owned the house on Vance Road outright, because Anna had been insistent about the mortgage being paid down aggressively, so aggressively that some months it had been uncomfortable, and she had known it was uncomfortable, and had done it anyway because she had a specific fear of debt that was rooted in watching her parents manage it badly, and that she had carried into her financial life as a discipline rather than an anxiety. The house was paid off. He had a truck. He had tools worth approximately $40,000 at replacement value. He had a business, not a formal company, just Owen Grady, licensed general contractor, that was billing around $280,000 a year in residential renovation work, which after materials and subcontractors and the cost of the truck and insurance and his own labor came to about $112,000 in take-home. He had $114,000 in savings, in a Vanguard brokerage account at Vanguard.com that Anna had opened, and that Owen had kept contributing to after she died, putting in $3,000 every month the way she had established, and not thinking too hard about what the balance was, because thinking too hard about the balance was the kind of thing that led to decisions that were not decisions but reactions. He had thought about what to do with $114,000 and a paid-off house and a trade that was reliable and a child to raise alone. He had thought about it the way Anna would have thought about it, not romantically but concretely, in the terms of what produced the most durable result for the specific situation he was in. He had bought a duplex in Smyrna, not a dramatic first purchase. A 1962-built brick duplex on Oakdale Road, 3 blocks from the house on Vance Road, that had been listed on Zillow for $198,000, and that he had bought for $186,000 after an inspection that had revealed some issues he had priced correctly in the negotiation, because he was a contractor and could price issues correctly. He had put $40,000 down, taken a mortgage at a rate that was, in the year he bought, still historically low, and had rented both units the week after the closing at $1,200 per unit per month. He had fixed the issues himself, on weekends and evenings, while Lily slept or drew at the kitchen table with the Melissa and Doug art set that was her current constant project, the one she carried from room to room and set up wherever he was working because she did not yet want to be in a different room than him, and he did not want her to be. That was the beginning. What came after was not a story of dramatic acceleration or a brilliant strategy. It was a story of a person who built things correctly and slowly, and who understood from 21 years of building that the things that lasted were the ones that were built correctly rather than quickly, and that the difference between the two was usually invisible until the point at which it was not. What he built in the dark, Owen Grady did not talk about money. This was not a performance of modesty. It was the natural behavior of a person whose financial life had been built in private, in the margins of a trade that other people considered a working-class profession, and therefore a financial ceiling rather than a foundation, and who had not corrected this assumption because the assumption did not affect his ability to continue building. He had bought the duplex on Oakdale Road at 38. At 40, he had refinanced it, pulling out $60,000 in equity at a rate that penciled correctly, and had used the $60,000 as part of the down payment on a 6-unit apartment building on Concord Road in Smyrna, a 1970s-built building that needed the kind of work that would discourage most buyers, and that he could do himself, which was the specific arbitrage he had understood from the beginning. His labor was capital, and his capital could acquire things that his labor could then make worth significantly more than he had paid for them. He had done this slowly. One property, then another, then a refinance, then another property. He had never taken on more debt than the cash flow of the existing portfolio could service if 2 units sat vacant simultaneously, which was the stress test he applied to every acquisition, and which had come from Anna's instinct about financial conservatism, translated into the specific language of real estate underwriting. He had kept his carpentry business running through all of it, because the business was what paid the living expenses and Lily's school costs, and the grocery trips to Publix on Smyrna Roswell Road, where he bought the same things every week, because he had discovered that the decision fatigue of varying the grocery list was a real cost in a life that already had enough decisions in it. He bought McCann's steel-cut oatmeal and a 2-pound bag of Granny Smith apples and a half-gallon of whole milk and a pound of boar's head turkey from the deli counter and a block of sharp cheddar and a bag of brown rice, and whatever vegetables were good that week. And he made dinner every night at 6:15, which was when Lily expected it, and when the expectation of it was itself a structure that was useful. He had kept from the beginning a spreadsheet in Google Sheets that tracked every property, every unit, every rent payment, every expense, every mortgage balance, every assessed value, every capital improvement cost. He updated it every Sunday evening after Lily was asleep, at the kitchen table with the Mockamaster coffee and the laptop. And the updating was the Sunday ritual that served the same function the watercolor class had served years before, which was the time of deliberate, private attention to the thing that mattered. His neighbor down the street, a retired civil engineer named Harold Fitch, who had worked for the Georgia Dot for 31 years, and who had known Owen since Owen moved to Vance Road, and who made it his business to know the neighbors because he considered this a basic obligation of living in proximity to other people, had asked Owen once. Over the fence between their yards on a Saturday afternoon when Owen was turning the compost pile with a Fiskars 60-inch D-handle garden fork and Harold was dead-heading the knockout roses along his side of the fence, whether he ever thought about getting out of the trades. Owen had thought about the question for a moment. He had said, "I think about it the way you think about things that were the right choice at the time, not whether to undo them, what they give you to work with." Harold had nodded the nod of a man who recognized the answer as the answer of a person who was not conflicted about the question, and had returned to the knockout roses, and they had not revisited the subject because the subject had been addressed, and Harold was a person who did not revisit addressed subjects. What the trades had given Owen to work with was this: the ability to look at a building and see what it was and what it cost to make it what it could be, and what it would rent for when it was, and what that rental income would service in terms of debt, and what that debt would be worth retiring, and what the equity would be worth refinancing, and what the refinance proceeds could acquire, and what that acquisition could become. This was not a formula. It was a way of seeing, and it had developed over 21 years of looking at buildings professionally, of understanding them from the inside, of knowing where the value was hidden in the things that needed repair versus the things that were structurally sound versus the things that were simply underpriced, because the market could not read them the way he could. He had been reading the Atlanta commercial real estate market this way for 3 years before the Callaway Tower opportunity emerged. He had been patient with it, which was his natural mode, looking at properties the way he looked at wood grain before a cut, with the full attention that precedes commitment, finding the angle that revealed what was true about the material rather than what was visible on the surface. The Callaway Tower had been on his list for 14 months before it became available. He knew the building. He had done renovation work on 2 of its tenant spaces in 2017 and 2019, contracted by the building's property management company to install custom millwork and reconfigure partition walls on the 6th and 8th floors. He had been in every mechanical room and had seen the building's bones, and had understood from the bones that the 2014 renovation had been done correctly, which was rarer than it should have been in a building of that age in that market. He had known the previous owner, a commercial real estate investment trust based in Dallas, was looking at a portfolio rebalancing that would likely put the Callaway Tower on the market within 2 years. He had known this because one of the building's property managers, a woman named Keisha Norris, who had managed Callaway Tower for 6 years, and who had contracted Owen for the 2019 millwork job, and had appreciated that he had done it on time and on budget, and without the sequence of change orders that most contractors in that size range used as a revenue mechanism rather than an acknowledgement of genuine scope changes. Had mentioned it to him over coffee at the Starbucks on West Peachtree Street after the 2019 job was complete. She had mentioned it in the way people mention things to people they trust, without a specific intention, but with the understanding that the information was worth sharing. He had been watching since. He had been building the capital position since. He had been working his banker, a commercial real estate lender named David Osai at Amaris Bank on Peachtree Road, since the year before, not by lobbying for a loan, but by bringing his complete financial records to a meeting in February, and presenting them with the same organized clarity Anna had established in the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, and letting the records speak in the way that records speak when the person who assembled them understood what they were for. David Ose had looked at Owen's records for 45 minutes. Then he had looked at Owen and said, "What are you trying to do?" Owen had said, "I want to acquire a mixed-use commercial building in Midtown Atlanta, in the 14 to 22 million range, when the right one becomes available." David had been quiet for a moment. Then he had asked 3 questions about the portfolio structure, and 1 question about the exit strategy, and 1 question about Owen's current carpentry revenue as a separate income stream. Owen had answered all 6 questions directly and without embellishment. David had made a note on a legal pad and said he would need to bring it to the Commercial Credit Committee with a full package, and that he would need 60 days to put the package together and 30 days for the committee review. Owen had said, "I'm not in a hurry. I'll be ready when the property is ready." David had looked at him across the desk for a moment and then said, in the specific tone of a lender who has sat across from a lot of people and has learned to identify the ones who mean what they say, "I believe you." The property had become ready 18 months after that meeting. The Dallas REIT had listed the Callaway Tower at $28 million, which was the price they needed for their portfolio rebalancing math. Owen had offered 26. They had countered at 27.5. He had held at 26 for 10 days, which was long enough to feel like a negotiation and not so long as to feel like an impasse. And the seller had accepted because the Dallas REIT's portfolio manager had assessed the deal and concluded that Owen's financing was certain. The amorous bank commitment letter had been clean and unconditional. And that 26 million certain was better than continuing to hold the asset while looking for 27.5 million in a market that was not, in November of that year, moving quickly. The deed recorded on a Tuesday. Andrea Torres drove to Vance Road in Smyrna with the manila envelope. Owen Grady signed for it at the door in his canvas Carhartt apron. The building that Brandon Calloway had named his company after. The building whose address was on the Nexus Digital Group letterhead, and whose conference room walls held the Atlanta Business Chronicle cover, and whose floors 11 through 12 housed the standing desk where the decisions were made. That building now belonged to the carpenter from Smyrna who had taught himself real estate from the bones up, and who had a vegetable garden along the south fence, and a daughter who was 9 years old and still appeared on Tuesday mornings with the left sock trailing. Lily Grady was 9 years old and was in the 4th grade at King Springs Elementary School in Smyrna. And she was, by her teacher's account in the fall conference that Owen attended alone, as he attended all school events, the student in the class who asked the most questions that were not in the curriculum. The teacher, a woman named Ms. Cheryl Ockhaffer, who had been teaching 4th grade for 14 years and who had encountered several hundred 9-year-olds in that time and had developed, through that experience, a fairly complete catalog of the kinds of minds a 4th grader could have, had told Owen that Lily's questions were the kind that arrived sideways to the subject, from an angle that suggested she was always working a layer deeper than the presented material, and that this was, in Ms. Ockhaffer's experience, one of the more reliable early indicators of a particular kind of intelligence. Owen had said, "She's always been like that." Ms. Ockhaffer had said, "Do you know where it comes from?" He had thought about this. He had said, her mother. Anna saw things from the side. She called it reading the grain. You look at wood from the end, you can see the grain. You look at a situation from the side, you can see the structure. Ms. Ockhaffer had written reading the grain on her notepad. She had said, "That's a good phrase for what Lily does." Lily came to the shop sometimes on Saturdays when there was no school and Owen was working on a project. She did not help with the tools, because he had been explicit with her about the age at which the tools were available, and 9 was not it. But she sat on a stool he kept near the workbench and watched and asked questions that were generally either deeply practical. What does that joint do? Why that wood and not a different wood? What happens if you measure wrong, or entirely philosophical? Why do you make new things out of old wood? Does wood remember being a tree? If you build something, will it last after you're gone? He answered all the questions. The practical ones he answered with demonstrations where possible, showing rather than telling, because showing was how he had learned, and because he believed it was how she learned too, the thing becoming comprehensible through the doing rather than the describing. The philosophical ones he took seriously, which was the only honest response to a 9-year-old who was asking genuinely. On the Saturday after the closing, the November Saturday when the pine straw mulch bag was still on the porch steps, Owen had been in the shop working on a commission, a custom built-in bookcase for a client in Vinings, white oak with hand-cut dovetails on the face frame corners, which was the kind of detail that took more time than clients sometimes expected, and that Owen included anyway because the dovetail at a corner joint was the correct joint for the load, and because doing it correctly was not a performance of craft, but simply the right way. When Lily had come out from the house in her Patagonia Retro X fleece jacket in teal that she had owned for 2 years, and that still fit because Owen had bought it a size up on purpose, which was the kind of deliberate forward thinking about the practical that he had learned from Anna, and she had climbed onto the stool and looked at the bookcase in progress. She said, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Is it true you bought a building?" He looked at her. Harold Fitch through the fence on a Tuesday evening. Harold did not gossip, but Harold was interested in things. He said, "Yes." She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Like an actual building, with floors?" He said, 14 floors. She was quiet with this for a moment. The shop had the specific quality of warmth that a small heated space gets in November when the work has been going for a few hours. The warmth of the heater's choice 1500W electric workshop heater, and the friction of the tools, and the particular quality of air that includes wood dust and linseed oil, and something else that did not have a name but that Lily associated with being in the shop with her father, which was the smell of work being done correctly. She said, "Does that mean we're rich?" He looked at her. He thought about how to answer this honestly, which was the only way he answered things. He said, "It means we have a building. It doesn't mean we have money in our hands. The building has to pay for itself first and then pay what we borrowed to buy it, and then after that it produces income that is ours. That takes time." She said, "How long?" He said, "A few years if we manage it well." She said, "Will you manage it well?" He said, "I think so." She said, "Mom would say that's not a good enough answer." He looked at her. A beat. He said she'd be right. "Yes, I'll manage it well." Lily nodded. She looked at the bookcase. She said, "The dovetails are for the load." He said, "Yes." She said, "Mom would have liked that you bought a building." He said, "Yes, she would have." He said it in the register he used for the things about Anna that were simply true and that did not require elaboration or any response other than confirmation. He had worked to develop this register over 5 years because Lily needed him to be able to talk about Anna with the same groundedness he brought to everything else, and the register had been hard to find at first and was easier now, not because the weight had changed, but because he had learned to carry it while still being upright. Lily got off the stool. She said she was going in to make hot chocolate. She said, "Did he want some?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The good kind, not the packet kind," and he said, "Yes. The good kind, which was made with whole milk and Valrhona cocoa powder from the Publix baking aisle and 2 squares of Ghirardelli 72% dark chocolate bar melted in, which Anna had taught them both, and which was the standard against which all other hot chocolate was measured in the Grady house and would continue to be." She went inside. He turned back to the dovetail. He set the festal domino and thought about the joint. He thought about what lasted. Brandon reads the letter. Brandon Calloway read the letter from Grady Holdings LLC on a Wednesday morning at the standing desk on the 11th floor. He had been in the middle of a product review meeting that he had stepped out of to deal with what Portia had described as a building-related communication that she thought he should see, and he had read it standing in the hallway outside the war room with his phone in one hand and the letter in the other. He had read it twice. He had asked Portia who Grady Holdings was. He had waited the 20 minutes for her to come back and tell him there was no public profile, no press mentions, no LinkedIn, no website. He had gone back into the product review meeting and had completed it, and had then closed the war room door and stood at the window for approximately 4 minutes, looking at West Peachtree Street below and the midtown skyline in the November midday. He was not alarmed. The letter had been professional and had confirmed the lease would be honored. A change of ownership at the building level did not affect the business, but something in the information was pulling at a part of his attention that was not the operational part, the part that processed risks and contingencies and adjusted course. It was a different part, the part that was responsive to the specific phenomenon of encountering something that contradicted a quiet assumption he had not known he was making. The assumption was that the building existed as a fixed and known quantity, that he understood what kind of thing it was, and who it belonged to and what that meant. The Dallas REIT had been the kind of owner that a building of this type was supposed to have: institutional, remote, managed through a property management company, present in documentation rather than in person. That was the expected structure of the relationship between a tenant of this size and a building of this address. The building now belonged to someone named Owen Grady, who had no public profile and lived in Smyrna and did not, apparently, have a press agent, a communications director, a LinkedIn profile, or any of the apparatus that Brandon associated with people who owned 14-story buildings in Midtown Atlanta. He had asked Portia to set up an introductory meeting, not because he was required to, because he was curious in the way that the children of quiet, patient people were sometimes curious about quietness and patience in others, curious about the specific quality of accumulation that happened in private, without announcement, while the world's attention was elsewhere. He had thought, briefly, about his father in the aluminum John boat at Lake Lanier in the early morning, the thing that was actually his. The meeting they met on the first Thursday in December, at 7:30 in the morning, at the building's ground floor coffee tenant, a local operation called Junction Coffee that had been in the Callaway Tower lobby for 3 years, and that served a house-roasted dark blend from a La Marzocco Linea PB, in white that the barista, a young man named Terrell who had been there since Junction opened, and who knew every regular tenant's order, had always thought was the most handsome machine he had ever worked with. Portia had offered a conference room. Owen had said the lobby coffee was fine, which was what he said because it was true, and because he had never been comfortable in conference rooms, and had always found that conversations that needed to be real went better in places where there was no table between the people having them. Owen came in from the street at 7:28, in dark work pants and a canvas field shirt in olive green and red wing, 2403 mock toe boots in brown leather, that had 7 years of use in them, and that he had resoled twice at the cobbler on Atlanta Road in Smyrna, which was a cobbler's shop that had been there since 1978, and that Owen went to for the same reason he went anywhere that had been doing something well for a long time. Because duration was its own form of evidence. Brandon was already there, at a small table by the window, in the dark jeans and crew neck sweater that was his working uniform when the day did not require him to perform the CEO for an external audience. He stood when Owen came in, which was the instinctive thing and also the correct thing, and they shook hands across the small table with the handshake of two people who had not met before and who were each, in their own way, taking the measure of the person across from them. Brandon was 42. Owen was 44. There were 2 years between them and something else, the specific distance between the kind of life that had been public and the kind that had not, the kind that had been in magazines and the kind that had never been, and both men were aware of this distance in the ambient way you are aware of the dimensions of a room without measuring them. Terrell brought their coffees. Brandon had his usual, a double cortado. Owen ordered a drip coffee, black, which was what he ordered everywhere because black drip coffee was what he drank and the elaboration of the order was a signal he did not need to send. Brandon said, "Thank you for meeting me." Owen said, "Thank you for reaching out," a brief pause of the kind that occurs between two people who are each waiting for the other to set the register of the conversation. Brandon said, "I want to be direct. I don't know anything about you and I've tried." Owen looked at him. Not with surprise, not with amusement exactly, with the quality of mild acknowledgement. He said, "That's on purpose." Brandon said, "Why?" Owen considered this in the way he considered questions that deserved actual thought rather than the reflex of a practiced answer. He said, "I built something that I didn't need anyone to know about while I was building it. Attention is expensive. It costs energy and it costs time and it sometimes costs the clarity you need to make the next decision correctly." Brandon looked at him. He said, "How long have you been building?" Owen said, "Since I was 38. Brandon said, 6 years. Owen said, "Yes." Brandon said, "And before this building," Owen described the portfolio briefly in the way he described things that did not require performance with the facts in the order that made the logic clear. The duplex on Oakdale Road, the refinance, the 6-unit on Concord Road, the small commercial strip on Windy Hill Road. The portfolio that had grown from the inside out, property by property, each one financed by the equity the previous one had built. Brandon listened the way he had learned to listen to people who were building things from specific knowledge rather than from strategy, which was without interruption, and with the kind of respect that recognizes a different mode of construction but an equally serious one. When Owen finished, Brandon said, "You did this while running a carpentry business." Owen said, "The carpentry business was what made it possible. The tools I brought to the buildings came from the buildings, both things." Brandon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window at West Peachtree Street in the December morning, the midtown traffic moving in its usual pattern below. He said, "I named this company after this building, not because of the building specifically, but because of what the address meant. What having this address meant about what we had become." Owen said, "I know." Brandon said, "And now you own it." Owen said, "Yes." A silence, not an uncomfortable one, the specific silence of two people who are both sitting with the same fact from different positions. Brandon said, "What made you choose this building?" Owen thought about this. He said, "I did renovation work on the 6th and 8th floors in 2017 and 2019. I knew the bones. The 2014 renovation was done correctly. The mechanical systems were right. A building that's been built and maintained correctly is worth more than its price says it is, because the price reflects the market and the market doesn't always see what's inside the walls." He paused. He said, "I also like that it was named Callaway Tower before your company was called Callaway anything." Brandon looked at him. Owen said, "The building had the name first. The name came from the original developer, a man named Thomas Callaway, who built it in 1987. Your company chose the name because of what it associated. The association was real, but it was borrowed." Brandon looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was a genuine laugh, the unmanaged kind, the kind that comes out of recognition rather than performance. He said, "Nobody has said that to me before." Owen said, "It's not a criticism. You built something real with it. The name worked. I'm just saying the building was here first." Brandon said, "Yes, it was." He looked at the coffee. He looked at Owen. He said, "Are you going to raise the rent?" Owen said, "Not unless I have to. Your lease is your lease. At renewal, we'll talk about what's fair for both of us. I'm not in the business of extracting from tenants. I'm in the business of owning buildings that are worth owning." Brandon said, "What makes a building worth owning?" Owen said, "The same thing that makes anything worth building. The right materials, done correctly by people who care about whether it lasts." Brandon looked at him. He thought about his father's aluminum John boat at Lake Lanier. He thought about the MacBook Pro with the sticker removed on the first morning. He thought about the cover on the wall of the war room and what it meant to the team and what it meant to him separately, the two meanings not the same. He said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Owen said, "You can ask." Brandon said, "You do this alone?" Owen said, "My daughter asks similar questions." Brandon said, "How old is she?" Owen said, 9. Brandon said, "And her mother?" A beat, a specific beat. Owen said, "She died 5 years ago. Anna, she was a nurse." Brandon said, "I'm sorry." Owen said, "Thank you. She would have had opinions about the building." Brandon said, "What kind of opinions?" Owen looked at the coffee. He looked at West Peachtree Street. He said, "She would have asked me whether I was building it for the right reason. She did that. She was a practical person, but she always wanted to know the reason behind the practical." Brandon said, "What would you have told her?" Owen was quiet for a moment. He said, "That I was building it for Lily partly, and partly because it was the next thing that could be built correctly and I wanted to build the things that could be built correctly." Brandon said, "And is that enough of a reason?" Owen said, "It was enough for Anna. A silence. A full kind. The specific silence of a conversation that has arrived somewhere real." Terrell behind the La Marzocco was making an order for a woman in a wool coat who was not part of their conversation, and the sound of the machine and the street and the building above them ran in the background, the building going about its business, indifferent and present, doing what buildings do when they are built correctly and maintained correctly and owned by someone who understands what they are for. Brandon said, "I'd like to talk again. Not about the lease. About other things." Owen said, "I'm usually in the building on Tuesdays." Brandon said, "Junction coffee?" Owen said, "Unless you have a better suggestion." Brandon looked at him. He said, "I don't." What Harold Fitch saw Harold Fitch was 68 years old and had lived on Vance Road in Smyrna for 22 years, which was 2 years longer than Owen had lived there and 4 years longer than Anna had. And he had known the house on Owen's side of the fence through multiple owners and had formed, over 22 years of proximity, the specific quiet knowledge of a long-time neighbor. The knowledge of comings and goings, and what kind of light was on at what hour, and what kind of work was done in what season. He had watched the vegetable garden go in along the south fence in the year after Anna died, which was how he had understood that Owen was not going to leave the house the way some people left houses where they had lost someone, that he was going to stay and make the house more rather than less, which Harold had considered the correct response, and which had confirmed for him that Owen was the kind of neighbor worth having for another 20 years. He had watched the shop behind the house fill up with tools that he recognized, from his 31 years at the Georgia Dot and his own modest weekend woodworking, as serious tools, the tools of a person who was not woodworking as a recreation but woodworking as a mode of thought. He had watched Owen work in the shop on weekday evenings and weekend mornings, with the specific, unhurried focus of a person who understood that the quality of attention you brought to a thing was inseparable from the quality of the result. He had watched Lily grow from a 4-year-old who followed Owen around the yard with the solemn attentiveness of a child who understood that she needed to stay close to the remaining parent, to a 9-year-old who appeared in the shop on Saturdays and asked questions that Harold, overhearing occasionally through the open shop door, had thought were the questions of a child who was going to be someone. He had not known, for most of the 6 years, about the real estate. Owen had not told him, and Harold had not asked, because Harold had understood, from the 22 years, and from what he knew about Owen's nature, that Owen's financial life was the kind of private that deserved to stay private, not because there was anything to hide, but because the building of it happened in a register that was not the register of the fence conversation, and Harold respected registers. He had learned about the Callaway Tower on a Tuesday evening in early November, the evening after the deed recorded. Owen had come to the fence at dusk when Harold was covering his outdoor plants with frost cloth, the tender ones that had made it through October, and that Harold was trying to carry through the first hard frost, and Owen had helped him with the frost cloth, which was the kind of thing neighbors did on Vance Road and had always done. And when they had finished, Owen had looked at the covered plants for a moment and then told Harold about the building. He had told it in the plain way he told important things, which was in the order they had happened and without embellishment and with the specifics where the specifics mattered. The building on West Peachtree Street, the 14 floors, the price, the Ameris Bank financing, the years of building toward it. Harold had listened without interrupting. When Owen finished, Harold had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "Your father would be proud." Owen had looked at him. Owen's father, Robert Grady, had been a pipefitter in Marietta who had died of a heart attack at 57, when Owen was 29 and had been a journeyman carpenter for 6 years. Robert had been, by Owen's description on the occasions he had mentioned him, a man who did his work without acknowledgement because acknowledgement was not what the work was for. He had installed the pipes that carried the water and the heat and the gas through the buildings that other people lived in, and he had done it correctly, and he had expected no memorial for the correctness because the correctness was its own sufficient thing. Owen said, I think he'd have questions about the debt structure. Harold laughed. The real kind. He said he'd come around. Owen looked at the frost-covered plants and the fence and the November dark settling in over Vance Road. He said, I think so too. Harold said, Owen. Owen said, yeah. Harold said, Anna too, she'd be proud. Owen was quiet. He looked at the fence. He said, she'd ask me what the plan was for Lily. Harold said, what is the plan? Owen said, the same plan she made for me. You teach them the thing that matters to you and you trust that they'll find the version of it that is theirs. Anna taught me to look at the whole thing, not the parts. The whole structure. I'm teaching Lily to read the grain. Harold said, reading the grain. Owen said, her fourth grade teacher's phrase, from something I told her. Harold said, from Anna. Owen said, from Anna. The frost cloth covered the plants. The night air on Vance Road had the specific quality of November in Georgia, the cold that was not the deep cold but was the arrival of the cold, the announcement that the year was turning in the direction of its other half. Down the street, 2 houses away, a porch light came on, and then another, the street doing its evening thing, inhabiting itself the way streets do when the people who live there have been there long enough that the street itself has a character, has the specific quality of a place that is known. Harold went inside. Owen stood at the fence for another minute, looking at the covered plants and the garden and the sky above the roof of his house, the November sky doing what it did, clear and cold and enormous. He went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table with the Melissa and Doug art set and a drawing she had been working on, which was a building. 14 rectangles stacked, one above the other, with windows she had drawn individually, small and careful, each one a deliberate mark. He stood behind her and looked at the drawing. She said, without turning around, I looked it up online. It has this thing on top. He leaned down and looked at the drawing more carefully. She had added at the top of the building the mechanical penthouse level, the HVAC units and the elevator shaft housing, which she had apparently researched and rendered with a particular 9-year-old precision that was more accurate than most adults would have managed. He said, you got the penthouse right. She said, I always get it right. He looked at his daughter at the kitchen table, drawing a building he owned, with the same care and the same rightward lean in her posture that Anna had always had at a table when she was working on something that mattered. He stood there for a moment, and he did not say anything because the moment did not require anything said. He went to make dinner, 6:15. Lily expected it. What the building was for, 2 things happened in the 3 months after the closing that Owen had not specifically planned for, but that he understood, as they happened, to be the kind of things that happen when you build correctly over time. Not lucky accidents, but the natural results of a foundation that was solid enough to allow them. The first was a call from Keisha Norris, the property manager, in the 2nd week of December. Keisha had managed the building for 6 years for the Dallas REIT and had told Owen, when he called her the week after the closing to ask if she wanted to stay on, that she would like to very much if the management arrangement was the kind she could work with, meaning the kind where the owner was engaged and informed and made decisions based on the building's actual condition rather than on the projected return on the asset in a spreadsheet in Dallas. Owen had said that was the only kind he knew how to be. She had said she would stay. What Keisha had called to tell him in December was that a retail tenant on the 2nd floor, a dry cleaning operation that had been in the building for 9 years, was not going to renew its lease, which was expiring in February. The space was 2,200 square feet and had been generating $7,000 per month in rent. She thought, based on her knowledge of the Midtown retail market and the specific configuration of the space, that it could generate $12,000 to $14,000 per month with modest improvements if it were repositioned for food and beverage use, which the building currently lacked at the ground and 2nd floor level, and which would benefit the overall tenant mix. Owen had asked her what modest improvements meant. She had described them. He had walked the space the following Tuesday, in the morning before Junction Coffee opened, with a flashlight and a Bosch GLM 5027 CG laser measure, and the same calibrated attention he brought to every building assessment, looking at what the space was and what it cost to make it what it could be. He had come to the conclusion that she was right about the positioning, and that the modest improvements were modest in her estimate, because she did not know how to perform them herself and was pricing them at contractor market rate, which was the rate he charged his own clients. He could perform them at cost of materials plus his own labor, which was not nothing but was substantially below the contractor market rate. He had told her he would handle the improvements himself. She had looked at him for a moment and said, "You're going to do the work yourself?" He had said, "Yes, that's what I do." She had been quiet with this for a moment. Then she had said, "The Dallas people would have outsourced this and priced it at a level that made the reposition not worth doing." He had said, "I know." The second thing was a conversation with Brandon, on a Tuesday in January, at Junction Coffee, over the drip coffee and the cortado. The third of what had become a loosely regular Tuesday morning exchange, that neither of them had formalized, but that both of them had found useful in the specific way that conversations between people with different vantages on the same set of ideas were useful, which was not as transactions but as calibrations. Brandon had mentioned that Nexus Digital Group was in the early stages of evaluating a secondary office space, a smaller footprint than the West Peachtree presence, in the West Midtown area along Howell Mill Road, for the product and engineering teams who found the commute from the city's western neighborhoods more manageable. Owen had listened. He had said, "I know a building on Howell Mill. 2008 built, 4 floors. The owner has been holding it at a rate that doesn't reflect the market because the owner is a family trust that inherited it and uses the management company's quarterly reports as their primary source of building information." Brandon had looked at him. He said, "How do you know it's not reflecting the market?" Owen had said, "Because I looked at comparable deliveries on the same corridor last month, and the gap between what the building is charging and what the market is producing in that class is 22%. A building run on inherited assumptions rather than current data has a gap like that." Brandon said, "Are you telling me this because you want to buy it?" Owen looked at his coffee. He looked at Brandon. He said, "I'm telling you this because you mentioned needing space on the west side, and I know that building. If you're interested in the space, and if the economics of a direct lease with the owner are better than what the management company would offer, that is a situation where both things could be true at the same time." Brandon said, "Would you broker it?" Owen said, "I'd facilitate an introduction. I'm not a broker. I'd want to own the building at some point. Whether that's before or after you're in it is a sequencing question." Brandon looked at him for a long moment with the reading expression that he used for things he was genuinely evaluating. He said, "I keep trying to figure out what category you fit in." Owen said, "What categories are you trying?" Brandon said, "Real estate investor, contractor, something else." Owen said, "Carpenter." Brandon said, "Carpenter." Owen said, "The other things grew from that, from knowing how buildings work from the inside. The category is carpenter." Brandon was quiet. He thought about the aluminum John boat. He thought about the category being the thing that was actually yours. He said, "My father fishes. He retired from a state job, and the thing he did with the retirement was go back to the lake every morning. He spent 30 years doing a job that was available and that he did well, and that was not the thing. The lake was the thing." Owen said, "Yes." Brandon said, "You know what I'm saying." Owen said, "Your father knew the whole time." The patience of knowing the whole time and not losing it. Brandon looked at him. He said, "That's exactly it." Owen looked at his coffee. He said, "The buildings are the same thing for me. They're the application of what I know to something that lasts. The carpentry taught me how buildings work, and the buildings are the place where the teaching goes." Brandon said, "And Lily?" Owen said, "Lily is the reason the lasting matters. You build things that last because somebody's going to be here after you. If nobody's going to be here after you, you build them anyway because it's the right way to build. But if somebody's going to be here, the lasting has a face." Brandon looked at the window and the street and the building above them, 14 floors of it, going up into the December gray Atlanta sky. He said, "The building has a face now." Owen said, "Yes." He said it without drama, the way he said the things that were simply true, and the simplicity of it was more complete than any elaboration would have been. And both men sat with it for a moment in the Junction Coffee lobby of the Callaway Tower on West Peachtree Street, in the morning light of a January Tuesday. The building doing what buildings do when they are correctly built and properly maintained and owned by someone who understands what they are for. On his filing cabinet, the filing cabinet was still in the second bedroom. Owen had not moved it and had not intended to move it. It was a Hirsch 2-drawer letter legal file cabinet in black, purchased at Office Depot on Cobb Parkway by Anna in the 3rd year of their marriage, when she had decided that the box system she had been using for the household documents was not adequate to the documents the household was producing, and that a filing cabinet was the correct infrastructure for the long term. She had set up the system with the labeled folders in the categories that reflected the actual structure of their financial and administrative life. Mortgage, insurance, medical, taxes by year, vehicle, investments, property, when there was property, and a folder she had labeled Notes, which contained a legal pad with her handwriting on it that was not notes in the conventional sense, but was more like the running record of a person's thinking about the long term. The considerations she returned to periodically when she was updating the filing system or reviewing a decision. Owen had read the notes pad twice in the 5 years since Anna died. Once in the first year, when he had opened the cabinet to find the life insurance documents, and had found the pad in the process, and had read it while sitting on the floor of the second bedroom at 10:30 at night with the house quiet and Lily asleep, reading in the way you read the private record of a person who is no longer there to explain it, with the attention that is both reading and listening. And once more recently, in October, the month before the closing, when he had opened the cabinet to retrieve the portfolio documentation he needed for the Amorous Bank final submission, and had found the pad again and had sat on the edge of the bed with it and read it. Anna's notes were not a financial plan. They were the record of how she thought about money, which was, money was the tool you used to build the life that was yours and Lily's, and the life that was yours and Lily's was the one where you did the work that was the real work, the work you would do whether or not you were paid for it. And the money made that possible for as long as you needed it to be possible. And after that, the money was for Lily, so that Lily's choices were not limited by money in the way that some people's choices were limited by money. So that she could find the work that was real for her without the limitation of needing to do a different work first. There was a line near the end of the notes that Owen had thought about many times. It said, "The building is not the point. The life it makes possible is the point. Don't get the two confused." He had not gotten them confused. He kept the filing cabinet to make sure he did not. He had told Lily about the filing cabinet when she was 7, in the specific plain way he told her things about Anna that were important, which was without ceremony and without the performing of grief, but with the care of a person who is sharing something valuable. He had shown her the folders and the system and the notes pad. He had read her the line about the building not being the point. Lily had said, "What is the point?" He had said, "The life it makes possible." She had said, "What life?" He had said, "That's the part you get to figure out." She had nodded. She had looked at the filing cabinet for a moment with the specific, full attention she gave to things she was categorizing. Then she had asked if she could have a filing cabinet of her own. He had said, "When you have things that need filing." She had said, "I have things now." He had taken her to Office Depot on Cobb Parkway the following Saturday and bought her a Hirsch one-drawer desktop file cabinet in white, which was the same brand as Anna's in a smaller version, and she had set it up on the desk in her room and had started the first folder with a label she had made on the Brother P Touch label maker that Owen kept in the kitchen drawer for the same purpose. The first folder was labeled Important Drawings. The second folder, added 3 months later, was labeled Buildings. In the Buildings folder, as of November of the year Owen closed on the Callaway Tower, there was one document, a drawing of a 14-story building, rendered in colored pencil on standard printer paper, with 14 rows of individually drawn windows and a correctly rendered mechanical penthouse level at the top. In the bottom right corner of the drawing, in the careful, slightly too large handwriting of a 9-year-old who was working on getting smaller, she had written, "Dad's," not the building. Not the address, not the valuation or the square footage or the name on the marquee. Dad's, which was the most accurate description available, which was, if you read the grain, the whole story. Owen filed the Amorous Bank loan documents in the property folder and closed the filing cabinet and went to make dinner. Lily appeared at the kitchen door at 6:12 in her navy polo and one sock, which was how she appeared on school evenings as well as Tuesday mornings, the single sock being apparently a permanent feature rather than a Tuesday-specific one. He said, 6:15. She said, "I know, I'm early." She climbed onto the kitchen stool and opened her backpack and took out her math homework and her Ticonderoga No. 2 pencil and began working, with the particular focused quiet of a child who had learned that doing the homework before dinner was better than doing it after, because after dinner the focus was harder to find. He made dinner. Brown rice and roasted chicken thighs and broccolini from the Publix on Smyrna Roswell Road, which was the Tuesday dinner because the Tuesday dinner was always this. The way the Sunday dinner was always pot roast, and the Thursday dinner was always pasta, the routine being the constancy that Anna had said Lily needed, and that Owen had found he needed too, the structure of the known things that let the unknown things arrive without becoming overwhelming. The kitchen smelled the way the kitchen smelled on Tuesday evenings, which was the specific compound of roasting chicken and rice, and the Mockamaster's last hour of warmth, and the rosemary plant on the counter that still needed water and that he would water after dinner. The Callaway Tower stood 14 stories tall on West Peachtree Street in Midtown Atlanta, its windows lit from within by the people doing their Tuesday evening work in its offices. The work of 43 tenants ranging from a technology company worth over $1 billion to a dry cleaning operation in its last weeks, from a design firm on the 5th floor to a private wealth management practice on the 10th. All of them doing their various work inside a building that had been built correctly in 1987 and renovated correctly in 2014, and that had changed hands on a Tuesday in November to a carpenter from Smyrna who had driven his 2016 Ford F-150 XL work truck to Rosenthal and Vance LLP on Peachtree Street to sign the closing documents, and had driven home to Vance Road, and had answered the door in his Carhartt apron, and had looked at the November light over the roof of the house next door and had then turned, because Lily needed him, because dinner was at 6:15, because the building was not the point. The life it made possible was the point. The vegetable garden along the south fence had been put to bed for the winter with pine straw mulch. In the spring, he would plant it again. Tomatoes and Cherokee, purple heirlooms from Territorial Seed Company, and 2 rows of pole beans, and the collard greens that his mother had grown, and that he grew because of her. Because the growing of specific things was one of the ways you kept the people you had learned them from. Lily would help with the planting the way she helped every year, in the specific, competent way she had learned from the beginning, sowing the seeds at the correct depth and spacing because he had taught her the depths and spacings, and she had memorized them the first time and did not need to be reminded. The spring would come. The garden would go in. The building would stand on West Peachtree Street with its lights on, and its 43 tenants doing their work, and Owen would be in it on Tuesdays, and sometimes Brandon would be at Junction Coffee at 7:30, and Keisha Norris would manage what needed managing with the engaged and informed management that buildings deserved, and Lily would have new things to put in the building's folder in her Hirsch one-drawer desktop file cabinet, and the Master would brew what needed brewing. And the rosemary plant would be watered, and the work would continue. The work always continued. That was what work was for.